Since I've been serving UU Miami, I've taken opportunities to look more deeply into the history of the United States through different lenses. In the past, I read about American historical figures to learn about them more as human beings, flawed like the rest of us, rather than pristine heroes who did no wrong. Reading the biographies of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin, and others. But history is not just about old white guys. It's about all people. And it's not only about other people, it's also about how they viewed the world, what was happening around them. As we know, any two people can see a situation, and when asked to describe it, they often have very different interpretations, even facts that they perceive as integral to the situation. As we hear different interpretations, if we only hear the one, like the one offered by old white guys, we have a very narrow view of a history. And consider this in the light of generations of history. Recently, Beacon Press, which is the press for the Unitarian Universalist Association, has been putting out a series of books, and they call it Revisioning American History, offering historical views of what many of us were taught in history, but through the lens of Indigenous people, black women, African American and Latinx, queer and disabled people. These communities are underrepresented in our history books, in our national holidays, and often in cultural representations of the United States. And I guess I encourage us to begin looking at the world through the eyes of others, people different from us, from you, from I. Now, I've also not just been reading some of these books, I've also been reaching out to different news sources, and some of you may do that already. CNN, MSNBC, ABC. But what I'm looking for are really different views that help me look at the world very differently. Native News Online for an Indigenous view. The Root for a Black American's view. Disability Scoop for a person with disabilities view. And as I read these, I try to keep an open mind. You know, it's not just what I read, it's what I see as well. You know, in my mind, the images I have for these various marginalized groups have been inundated through social media, through the television, through my parents, through my upbringing. Maybe the case is for you as well. Even as we look at the image that was up before, let's put the image up that was up before, if we can. Oh, maybe not. We had an image before that was a Native American, that one. And that's the image that I had in my mind of what an Indigenous person looked like, and perhaps you as well. But let's go on to the next slide. My friends, these are the Indigenous people who have spoke to us in our Indigenous Studies class here at the church. They may not be what you think. Is that how you see Indigenous people? As many of you know, this congregation has devoted time and resources to learning more about various Indigenous peoples, his view of history, and of the present circumstances that they find themselves in America. And so for me today, as I think about Indigenous Persons Day, which is celebrated tomorrow, questions rise up. Why should we replace Columbus Day with an Indigenous Peoples Day? How can we show respect during an Indigenous Peoples Day? How will setting aside a day in the year to consider the importance and meaning of Indigenous people in this country make any difference, any substantial, any real difference in how we see ourselves as citizens of this country? And I wonder what you're thinking as I begin talking today. I wonder, I try to project into your minds what you might be thinking, and wonder if you have thoughts like, all Reverend Tom talks about are Indigenous people. Or, why didn't Reverend Tom get an Indigenous person to speak on Indigenous Persons Day? Or is Reverend Tom telling us we should stop celebrating Columbus Day? In some of my past congregations, I've been accused of speaking too much about things. Social justice, Black Lives Matter, white supremacy culture. And I know I've spoken a few times from this pulpit about Indigenous people. Is that too much? I guess my answer is I don't know. What I do know is it's what's on my heart and in my mind right now. Thinking and educating myself more about Indigenous people is stirring something within me, opening my eyes and ears to things I haven't thought about before or haven't considered in how I live my life. I did learn a few things, and maybe you did as well, in history class growing up. I did read about the smallpox blankets given to the Native Americans. June 1763, the fort besieged during the Potomac Rebellion. Soldiers and civilians in the fort had smallpox, as did some of the Native Americans. 2 Delaware dignitaries in the fort were set up to go do a parley with the Native Americans. And they were given 2 blankets and a kerchief out of the smallpox hospital to take out to the Native Americans. When they left, a trader and land speculator, William Trent, wrote in his diary, "I hope this has the desired effect." I have to say that got maybe a few sentences in my history book and maybe a question on a test. And we did in my class, we did talk about the Trail of Tears. Perhaps you heard about that in your history class as well, when Andrew Jackson who had been a long advocate of Indian removal when he was an army general, and spent years leading brutal campaigns against the Creeks in Georgia and Alabama and the Seminoles in Florida. Campaigns that resulted in transfer of hundreds of thousands of acres of land from Indian nations to white farmers. As president, he continued the crusade, and in 1830 he signed the Indian Removal Act, which gave the federal government the power to exchange native-held land in the Cotton Kingdom east of the Mississippi for the land in the west, the Indian colonized zone that the United States had recently acquired as part of the Louisiana Purchase. The law required the government to negotiate fair, voluntary, and peaceful treaties, but that didn't stop the president. President Jackson and his government frequently ignored the law and forced Native Americans to vacate their land that they had lived on for generations. In the winter of 1831, Under the threat of invasion from the U.S. Army, the Choctaw became the first nation to be expelled from its land altogether. They made the journey to the Indian Territory on foot, some bound in chains and without food supplies or any help. Thousands of people died along the way. It was one Choctaw leader told an Alabama newspaper, a trail of tears and death. Even that, maybe got a paragraph in a history book, maybe, for some, a short presentation in class, and maybe a couple of questions on a history test. How was I, as a student, to conceptualize these incidents from a vast history of the United States that was being presented? But I will tell you this. From very young, in elementary school, I was taught about the Nina and the Pinta and the Santa Maria. I was taught about Columbus. And I remember as a child feeling in awe about this explorer. He checked all the boxes for me, struggling to get his trip, a difficult journey, a new world, an adventure. And early in elementary school, I was taught a mnemonic poem to remember this discovery of America. Perhaps you were taught it too. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. I was taught this year after year, with teachers emphasizing how important that was to me as an American, as a citizen, and how I should remember every detail. Perhaps you had this same experience. Nicole Scott, co-director of the Native American Future Stewards Program, wrote, "For Indigenous people, this holiday is a reminder of what these classes failed to teach. That Columbus and his fellow explorers enslaved, murdered, and raped Indigenous people. In celebrating Columbus, the U.S. forgets the trauma and the pain that Indigenous people experienced. Colonization and assimilation are woven into the history of the Indigenous people. And that trauma remains today." He says, "As a Native American person, I am constantly reminded of just how much we're up against. We are seen as historical figures, not living beings. Our history is a glance in the history books." You know, it's only been in the past 10 years or so that I've even heard of replacing Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day. I think this was slow to take off. I mean, it was important to the Indigenous people, but other people, white people, didn't seem to understand. Even before I came to Miami a couple of years ago, I was only hearing a few Unitarian Universalists talking about Indigenous Peoples Day. And then last year, at this time last year, Chris Kirchner, who's a member of our congregation, decided to hold a remembrance of Indigenous Peoples Day in our memorial garden. And she reached out to a Miccosukee person, Houston Cypress, to help her out. They created posters surrounded by palm fronds and umbrellas for people to read and consider. And the posters, they spoke about the importance of land, environmental justice, about protecting the Everglades. I appreciated the work of Chris in Houston. It got me to wonder, how might I hold Indigenous Peoples Day in my heart and in my mind? What impact would embracing it have on my life and on this country's culture? You know, I'd like to talk to you some more about it maybe after the service, and maybe online or in here in the sanctuary. How might an Indigenous Peoples Day recognition look like if we held it here with our members and friends? I'm not sure. But I think perhaps we might give it some thought. So here we are, the day before Indigenous Peoples Day, and I invited you. I invited you to chant a prayer, a Navajo prayer from Mother Earth. I invited you to join me out on the land, the natural surroundings that we care for. I opened a few moments of silence for you to reflect on our walk, our chant. And I wonder what stirred for you. Perhaps you felt more connected to the land. Perhaps you thought about how we care about it. Are we good stewards of it? Perhaps you thought about how you might recognize Indigenous Peoples Day. Perhaps you might have thought about how authentically and significant it might become in your life by giving it some attention. You know, as I was thinking about this, I just felt like it was so important for us to get out on the land. I know it was just a few minutes, and I know there were just a few images of our land you may have seen. But you know, when I talk to all these Indigenous peoples from all over the country and even Canada, the words that they speak about, more often than any other, are about the land. It's central to them, to how they see themselves, how they lived on the land and are living on the land. Many Indigenous groups refer to their unique relationship with their particular traditional territory as, I belong to the land. As opposed to the classic Western articulation, this land belongs to me. I mean, I even say that. I say, this is our property. This is our campus. But you see, the former relationship, the Indigenous relationship, has a spiritual, physical, social, and cultural connection, more than just ownership. Land stewardship is not separate from who Indigenous people are. It is how they are as a people. Many Indigenous artworks tell about the connection between the people and the land. So we come back to our property. It's an image of our property here. Perhaps a place you haven't seen before. Perhaps you have. After hearing the different Indigenous people who have presented to our Indigenous Peoples History adult enrichment class, I've discerned that somehow land will figure into how I bring this day of remembrance more fully into my life. Whether it's being in nature or caring for nature or working for environmental justice, somehow that has to fit for me. And I invite you to think about that. Consider how land might fit into this day of remembrance for you. I want to share a story with you. It's from Evelyn, Keyway, Molina. She comes from the Paliku people of Western Australia. Now, I know they're not indigenous to America, but this Aboriginal culture in Australia has very similar understandings of the land as our indigenous people do. So let me share this story. A girl lost her way. She'd wandered far from her mothers, the aunties, the grandmothers, from her fathers and uncles and grandfathers. She'd hidden in a shallow of a rock and fallen asleep while she waited for her brothers and sisters to find her. And now it was nighttime. And no one answered when she called, and she could not find her way back to camp. The girl wandered alone. She grew thirsty, and so she stopped by a water hole to drink. And then she grew hungry, and she picked some berries from the bush. And then she grew cold, so she huddled beneath an overhanging rock, pressing herself into the hollow that had trapped the warm air of the day. Finally, she saw a crow flying in the moonlight, flapping from tree to tree, calling, caw, caw, caw. The girl followed the crow. She followed him through the trees and over the rocks and up the hills until at last she saw the glow of her people's campfire in the distance. When she arrived back with her people, they laughed and they cried at once, all at once, seeing her that she was safe. They growled at her for her foolishness and cuddled her in safe, secure arms and gave her place by the fire. Her little brother asked if she had been afraid out there all alone. But the girl said, "How could I have been frightened? I was with my mother. When I was thirsty, she gave me water. When I was hungry, she fed me. When I was cold, she warmed me. And when I was lost, she showed me the way home." My friends, may this Indigenous Peoples Day be a time when we open ourselves up to the land and cultivate our relationship to Mother Earth, so she too may show us